Hi guys, this is Lydia Wente, the lifestyle coach, and I'm coming to you live with pink eyeshadow. I'm trying out something today. I always get a little nervous when my little girl who is 6 sees my makeup or my outfit and she's just like, oh, wow, it's so beautiful. I mean, it's nice to get a compliment, but when you get a compliment because a 6-year-old loves your makeup or your outfit, you've got to think about it for a second and question, is this how I want to go out in public? But there we go. We're going with pink today because why not? Okay, so I want to be sensitive and careful, of course, with our topic for today, but I just think it's really important to explore this. So as I'm talking about the connection with sexual abuse and eating disorders, which is a really common sort of idea that's out there. I just want you to have an open mind, first of all, to be sensitive to I totally don't know everything. This is just from my experience and the data that I've gathered and, the research that I know about. And then the other thing is as you listen to something, this is just a good life tip for anything. But instead of listening to what I'm saying and putting it in the I agree or don't agree categories, like this binary thing, or this is good information or bad information, or this is right or this is wrong. If you just kind of absorb the information and just think, oh, isn't that interesting? Isn't that interesting? A lot of times you'll be able to learn and grow. And I'm not saying that I'm right, but I'm saying that might be a better way to just have this experience for this information. Okay, so let's talk about there's very much this idea of a link between eating disorders and that women have been sexually abused. So I want to be totally sensitive to this. Sexual abuse is a real thing that really happens, and I think it's definitely an important thing to address and make social change about, and awareness, and being able to deal with that. So please do not take anything of what I say minimizing the importance of dealing with it or the horrors of that is a real thing. Women, men, a lot of people have been sexually abused or are being sexually abused. So I'm not excusing that at all or being insensitive to any of that. So I just want to be really clear with that. But there is this idea, I teach I'm a lifestyle coach, so I help people to end or create habits in their life. And I work with a lot of women who are, binge eaters, bulimics, they were anorexics, and now they're binge eaters. So this is very much a population that I work with. I myself was a binge eater for years, and I am completely free and recovered from that eating disorder. So there's this idea in the therapy world. I teach the non-therapy approach to freedom from food. So there's a therapy idea. So this is not what I teach, but an idea that's out there that women binge eat or are bulimic or have an eating disorder because they're fulfilling some need. Actually, Katherine Hansen in her book Brain Over Binge, which is amazing, I would highly recommend it. I just got done recording the audiobook version of it. Now there's a lot of editing to do, but it's amazing. That's a life-changing book. She begins and ends that book with this idea of the eating disorders are connected to fulfilling some need. And she kind of debunks that in 300 pages. She does it much better than I can in the next few minutes. But there's this idea I binge eat because, I'm fulfilling some sort of damage that's been done to me in the past, some sort of need, some sort of, emotional thing, or whatever it is, I'm eating to fulfill that need in my life. So this is a connection that a lot of people think is a connection. So I'm just going to put this out there. I'm not saying that I know everything, but I'm going to put this out there just to think, what if those things aren't connected? What if the eating disorder is actually really about the food and just a habit that's been created? If it's just a habit, it's not necessarily fulfilling any sort of need. It's just a habit that we've gotten into. So like pop culture, like I seriously got these stats popping up with like a quick Google search of like, 40% of women with eating disorders have been sexually abused. So the idea is like, oh, a woman has been sexually abused, and now she has an eating disorder because she has to use food as, comfort from the negative feelings that she feels from these things. I know that sexual abuse is a real thing, and there, I'm sure, are negative feelings attached to that. But let's just say for a second that what if these things aren't attached? So I'm going to tell you 3 things that are just kind of interesting questions to ask ourselves when thinking of this popular belief. So, in the therapy, this is not what I teach. This is kind of the therapy approach. The therapy approach is, hey, you're eating to fulfill a need. Like you were sexually abused and now there's some sort of damage emotionally or some need that you have, and you're using food to heal that or fulfill that or whatever that is. So this idea that, okay, well, we've got to work through all of the negative consequences of your sexual abuse and then your eating disorder will go away because you're really eating because of this deeper issue. And that can, fill in the blank. That can be anything. So there's kind of, one approach in therapy of like, well, let's deal with your issues and then your eating disorder will go away. That is not what I teach, but that's important to contrast in our conversation here. So number one, so like let's say, this pop culture, like this idea that's out there that, 40% of women, who are sexually abused have an eating disorder. So number one, I'm going to tell you kind of 3 things to think about here. Number one is numbers are not always meaningful. Like, don't take numbers or statistics at face value, please. It will highly improve the smartness of your life if you don't. Okay, so let's just explore this for a second. Okay, 40% of women who are sexually abused have an eating disorder. And then we think, oh my goodness, they're so related because, wow, 4 out of 10 women who have an eating disorder, they've been sexually abused. But what if we took a totally different sample of women, not eating disorders? Let's say 40% of women who have termites in their house were sexually abused. 40% of women who have rose bushes in their yard were sexually abused. Like, this is a number, like there's this statistic, right? Of like, they look at women with an eating disorder and they look at sexual abuse. Realize you could literally fill in the blank with anything else. Maybe just 40% of women have been sexually abused. Like, it's something that I'm not saying that that's true. I'm saying that you can take this statistic and you need to like look at the numbers in a wider context and don't just take it as face value that 2 things are related. Okay, so that's number one. So numbers are not always meaningful. Number 2 is looking at the way that our brain works. So your brain always finds what it's looking for. So for instance, if you have a therapist, and I'm not saying that therapy is a bad thing, I'm not minimizing sexual abuse at all. These are just questions to explore, So the way that your brain works is it always finds what it's looking for. So let's say that you have a therapist that tells you, okay, so your eating disorder is because of the negative feelings from being sexually abused. So if you believe that, then those things are always connected for you. Like, or you could say, oh, your eating disorder is because of stress. Oh, well, I do have stress in my life. Oh, well, I do have negative feelings in my life. Like, realize that those things aren't necessarily connected because you could fill in the blank for anything, right? Your eating disorder is because of the old furniture in your house. Well, I do have a lot of old furniture in my house. Your eating disorder is because you have happy moments in your life. Wow, I can now think of happy moments in my life. Like, whatever it is that you believe your eating disorder is from, your brain will find evidence to connect those things. Does that make sense? Like, it's a self-serving bias. Like, your brain always finds what it's looking for. So those things might not necessarily be connected, okay? Also, assuming that you're eating to fulfill some sort of need or you have disordered eating to fulfill some need also makes it really, really heavy. Like you have those things connected now, right? So like every time you have an urge to like, binge or overeat or emotionally eat or whatever it is, even though we have that term, emotional eating assumes that it's just because of emotions, right? Like it also gives us kind of an out, like an excuse. Like I remember thinking that my eating disorder was because of the stress in my life. And so instead of not binge eating, because I didn't even know I had control over that, I was really not empowered at all because I thought, well, I eat to cope with the stress in my life. So I literally have to binge right now because that's the way that I cope with stress. Like I don't have another way to do it. So whatever it is we think our eating disorder is from, like if we have that connection, our brains will find evidence for it. And it's also not very empowering because we're saying like, well, this is what I have to do. Whatever it is with stress or negative feelings or whatever that is, if you don't think those things are connected, like, oh, I am binging just because I have an urge to binge, then dealing with that directly can be really empowering. So number 2, the way that our brain works, whatever you think your eating disorder is for, your brain will find reasons to support that because that's the way that your brain works. Number 3 thing to think about is that there are so many women that I coach that are fully recovered from binge eating or bulimia, and they didn't deal with any of this stuff. They didn't deal with the stress in their life. They didn't deal with the abuse of their past. Like, if those things were so connected, then why could women be completely free of their bad eating habits without dealing with these things? When there's this idea that you have to deal with your issues before you can get over your disordered eating. So another thing to think about there. I'm sure that there are women who have dealt with their issues in therapy and they do stop binge eating. And I mean, there are all types, right? Like I'm not saying that it is one certain way, but I'm saying they may not. Just to experiment with our minds. What if they're not connected at all, right? So what I do when I coach women is we treat their eating disorders just as a habit. Like you've formed a habit, let's break the habit, right? But with this idea of like, oh, it's connected, negative feelings, and abuse and all of these things, it makes it really heavy. And maybe those things aren't connected. So I also have a lot of women who come to me that, some of them have been going to therapy for 10, 20 years. Like 20 years is a pretty average amount of time that the women that I coach to freedom from food have been binging and or have been in therapy. And I have women say things like, I have dealt with all of my stuff. Like therapy has been great for dealing with all of my past issues and pain and, like negative feelings that came from this trauma and that trauma, but I still binge eat. Like I thought that would go away once I dealt with this stuff. So I think it's wonderful and important to deal with these things. But what if you could deal with all of your issues and still binge eat? Or what if you could stop binge eating without dealing with all your issues? Like, wouldn't you want to do that? Like, I think that's a really good alternative approach. And that's why I teach that, obviously, like, because I think it's a wonderful thing to just deal with the issue directly instead of attaching the issue to these other things. So really, the reason that I want to put this out there is just for kind of an alternative view, because we tend to make it so heavy because of all of these ideas. Oh, well, they had this eating disorder because it was really about control in their lives, or they had this eating disorder, because of this trauma of their past. What if we just treated it like, oh, they have an eating disorder because they got into a bad food habit. I guess they're working through it. Like, how would our society change if we were able to just like lighten it up a little bit? So, for instance, like, what if we just treated it like procrastination, right? Like the way that, oh, I'm such a procrastinator. Like, what if we had this feeling around eating disorders? One important thing why I'm putting this out there is because many of the women that I coach, they've been doing this for years. I'm literally the first person they have ever told about their eating disorder. Like, they have been binge eating in secret for years and years and years. Like there's such this stigma in our society around having an eating disorder, maybe because in popular belief we've attached it to all these things that women don't tell anyone. Like I'm the first one they've told. Like I would love a world where, you know, women and men, I say women because I work with a lot of women, but please don't feel like I'm not including men in this. You know, like it's such a stigma that they don't talk about it. What if we had a world where they could talk about it? Like if it had the feeling of procrastination, like, oh, I'm such a procrastinator. I've gotten into a bad habit of procrastinating. I'm working on it, right? Like what if we treated procrastination with the heaviness of eating disorders? Yes, I am a procrastinator. I use procrastinating to deal with my emotional issues, to deal with the trauma of my past. Like, you know, I'm working on it. Like it's just like this heaviness, like because we think of procrastinating as just like, gosh, got into a bad habit. You're working on it, right? Like I would love for eating disorders to be able to have that sort of feeling where people could say, yeah, you know what? I've gotten into this weird bad habit with food and I'm working on it. Like if we just had that lightness, I feel like women would feel a lot more comfortable with just being able to be open about it, because secrecy really perpetuates, you know, this feeling of shame or like something's wrong with me, you know, just having that lightness of like, hey, you know, it's all good. Like I just have a habit that I'm working on. And that's really the feeling that I try to bring with the women that I coach. So yeah, I think that if you have trauma in your past, if you've had abuse in your past, I think it's so important to deal with these things. But I would love for more women to have, you know, the possibility in their mind that they don't have to deal with all this stuff before they can fix their disordered eating. And you know what? I think that it's so much easier to deal with all the other problems in our lives once we get this huge thing like our disordered eating or our binge eating or our bulimia like out of our life. Like it's a whole lot easier to deal with stuff when you're not having to deal with disordered eating all the time. So really being able to take that direct approach. If you go to lydiavideo.com, I have a video series about the principles that I teach to overcome eating disorders by treating them just like by a habit that you're breaking. That's how I overcame my eating disorder. That's how I coach women to do it. I also have a video on there called The False Miracle Cure that explores this a little bit. This idea of like, well, I've got to fix all my issues before I can, you know, have my eating disorder magically go away on its own. So that's another place to look. lydiavideo.com. There's lots of great stuff. You can get my free ebook, How to Stop Binge Eating, at lydiawente.com. It's a free download. It comes right to your inbox, and there are 14 interactive videos there if you want to know more about these principles. So just putting it out there, what if all of the trauma in life wasn't necessarily connected to eating disorders? What if it was just a bad habit that we're learning to break, and there we go, and that's it? So just some food for thought, with being totally respectful and validating that this is a terrible thing in our society, something that absolutely happens, something that should be dealt with, but it might make it even more terrible to always have to feel like, you know, eating disorders are linked with some sort of trauma. What if it was just a bad habit? Lydia Wente, the lifestyle coach, just putting some ideas out there, and we'll talk to you later. Bye.